Okay, so you have your workbook open, and you're looking in the section that has your conceptualization. This part is the section that's giving the example that someone else had done. You want to click review and add comment, and just simply start going through and adding sample questions directly, linking one sentence at a time into your conceptualization. So you're only allowed to create questions that are part of your conceptualized variables. If you need questions, you think, to be able to measure what you intend on measuring, but you don't have that in your conceptualization, you then have to add it to your conceptualization. If you have things in your conceptualization that you don't need to connect to anything, you would then delete that from your conceptualization. So we don't, we have about a week to construct our conceptualization and DCI. So you want to think about how much time you have or need to create your DCI, how long your survey will be for your participants to take. Generally, there's not a correct length or incorrect length, and there's definitely not going to be a number I'm going to give you in regards to how many questions you're supposed to ask, because that's not the way that validity works. Essentially, you write as many questions as you need to measure your conceptualization, your conceptualized variable as a whole. So how many questions you have will be linked directly to your conceptualization. And then same thing if you're doing observational research. And then how much information can you get from each participant? So this is the catch-22. We're always trying to get as much information as we possibly can from each participant. The more data you can collect, the better. But you can only collect so much data from a participant at a time, because you can't overwhelm somebody with, like, say, for example, a 2,000-page survey. I have an example of a historical figure who did that, but we won't go into that. Okay, so some of the common mistakes: biased or leading questions, double-barreled questions, unclear questions, not following Shively's rules. So what you want to do is you want to have questions that are complete, comprehensive, and mutually exclusive. If they're missing any component of that, you have an inappropriate question or a question that's not valid, and questions that have irrelevant responses as part of their answers. So an example here, hello, do you have any opinions that fit into our preconceived questions? Thank you. And her answer is yes and no. So here we have a biased or leading question, a double-barreled question, and one that is not following Shively's rule. Okay, so a few examples of these. An incomplete question: how many hours a day do you spend doing homework? 0 to 1 hour, 120 minutes to 3 hours. So this is a good example of an incomplete question, because we're missing, a section. What if they do about an hour and 10 minutes a day doing homework, or more than 3 hours a day doing homework? It also is an example of how you should not create your answers, which if you're going to go hours, you need to stick with hours, or if you're going to use minutes, you want to stick with minutes. A question that's not comprehensive: how many hours a day do you spend doing homework? 0 to 1 hours, 4 to 5 hours, right? So this one's not comprehensive. And it's also not complete, because you would say 5 or more hours, 5 hours and 1 minute or more. Not mutually exclusive. This one is: how many hours a day do you spend doing homework? 0 to 5 hours, 4 hours or more. So if you spend 4.5 hours a day doing homework, then you have you have 2 places where you could answer the question. And so this most often happens when people say 0 to 1 hour, 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, 4 to 5 hours. So it needs, or you see this very commonly with money. How much money do you make per year? 0 to 10,000, 10 to 20,000, 20 to 30,000, 40 to 50,000. People make that mistake all the time. So if you make 40,000, you fit into 2 categories. So you always have to go 40,000 and a penny. And then sometimes people will forget, they'll say 4 to 500,000, but they'll say, 500,000 and a penny or more is not included, and that would be an incomplete example question. What is your favorite sport? Football, hockey, tennis, poetry. So an irrelevant response is here in the category of poetry. A biased or leading question sounds like this. What, in your view, is the best way to reduce violent crime in the U.S.? So this one's good because, the ones on the left are fairly simplified, but I think I've seen this one or some variation of this, right? So at ourselves, we think, okay, holistically reducing violent crime in the U.S. is a value that everybody has, but that's biased on our part. So, and we definitely have bias, everybody does. And when you are writing your survey and you're interested in this research topic, you probably have a biased perspective, or you wouldn't have chosen the topic to begin with, right? Just our mere interest in it is a form of bias, but we usually have an opinion one way or another. But as a scientist, it's not supposed to be part of your research. You're supposed to be neutral. So a lot of times we're out there trying to prove it's almost like we're trying to prove that we're right, or our ideas or our values are right. It doesn't matter how common that value is. You still are not supposed to be, your goal for this research or any research is never supposed to be to prove how your preconceived values or notions about the world are correct. You're supposed to be neutral, and you're supposed to find out if that's the case. So if I say something like, what in your view is the best way to reduce violent crime in the U.S., that means that I already know that the researcher believes that violent crime needs to be reduced. And so the 2 answers, reduce the number of guns sold in the U.S., or increase the penalties, they might be something that I agree with as well, but the question itself is leading us, and it's biased. A double-barreled question. This means that there's 2 separate answers or possibilities. Always, pretty much, a double-barreled question should have just been 2 questions. Do you believe professors are concerned with your grades in personal life? Well, maybe I believe they're concerned with my grades but not personal life, or my personal life but not grades. The fact that I have an and in there is the dead giveaway that I have a double-barreled question. An unclear question. Do you think incidences of violent crimes have increased in the past decade? Do you think they have decreased, or have they stayed about the same? So the question overall is confusing. The question is mixed into the answers, and the answers are not clearly indicated in a different section. So it's an unclear question in a variety of ways. Organization, format, and the way that the question was written. This is actually easier than you think to do because you're embedded in the work that you're doing. And so we kind of get this tunnel vision, and as we're working, things can become unclear when we write, That just happens to everybody normally. The more work you do, the more likely that is to happen. So one of the ways that we avoid this one in particular is you have somebody take your survey, not your partner, not your research partner. You have somebody that has not seen this stuff take it and let you know if there's issues. And then, of course, not following Shively's rule. So Shively's rule is you're supposed to collect data at its most detailed possible. So if you can collect it interval ratio, you should not be collecting it ordinal. If you can collect it ordinal, you should not be collecting it nominal. You can run a lot of different analysis tests in SPSS if you collect things interval ratio. If you collect them ordinal, there are still options, but not as many. And then you basically leave yourself with almost no options. I'm trying to think, there's one. It starts with a W and I can't remember the name of it. That you can use if you only have nominal data, but you basically can't run any analysis with nominal data. That doesn't mean you can't have nominal questions, because you can have nominal questions that add up to become interval ratio, like a scale. And you will have to add your questions together. So they can, all add up and create like a scale form. But you cannot run an analysis simply on nominal questions or a nominal variable. You can't run hardly anything. Like, I'm not going to say you can't do anything, but your options are very limited at that point. So you're trying for you're trying for interval ratio, and if you can't, do ordinal, like Likert Skills. Okay, so this one, I just want you to read through and see if you can identify some of the common mistakes on your own. Once you have gone through into your conceptualization and written out the questions, and you are aware of some of the common mistakes that you can make, you also want to consider, prior to designing your survey, how you would like your questions. Do you want them unstructured, partially structured, structured, or something like a Likert Skills, or are you going to have other types of questions that are going to end up adding up to a ordinal or interval ratio scale? So you do want to consider these things. So you're definitely not going to do unstructured or what we would call postmodern questions. This is where you might be doing research, either exploratory research, or you've been doing the research for a long time. You probably go in with a recorder and you simply ask questions. You may have an idea of 10 or 15, 20 questions that you're going to ask, but you don't have them written out. You might have just the topics for each question. If the research moves into a different, or the conversation in the survey moves into a different direction, you continue to follow it. So this does not create consistency or reliability. It is great for searching for new information. It is very qualitative in nature, the data that you get back. And so it's a totally different type of analysis and not one that you would do in SPSS. Partially structured questions, on the other hand, these are questions where you might have drafts of questions. Again, they're open-ended answers, so think essay as opposed to multiple choice exam. And so people can answer any way they want. Again, this lends towards qualitative analysis, which we're not doing in this class. And even though this may seem easier to begin with, because it does often appear like it's easier to create the unstructured or partially structured questions, it's because it's less time consuming. It's much more complicated and time consuming to do the qualitative analysis on these types of questions because your data is all over the place. So what you're going to be doing is structured questions. Think multiple choice questions as opposed to open-ended survey questions. So unless you specifically are just looking for somebody to fill in one-word examples, you should really have no unstructured questions. They should all have structured, written down questions and responses. So an unstructured question would look something like this. What do you like best about the sociology program? A partially structured question is more like this. Why did you sign up for the sociology program? Select all that apply, and then you do see other is an option is there as well. And then structured, what is your class rank at CSULB, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, other? So we are looking for structured, closed-ended questions. Let's talk a little bit about Likert skills. People are going to often want to use Likert skills. It does make sense for a lot of people. By the way, Likert and Likert are both correct. Maybe not technically, but culturally they're both correct. Most people say Likert. I do believe the person who it was named after his name was actually pronounced Likert. So when you create a Likert skill, you need to have your neutral and a one-way or two-way intensity scale, right? So strongly disagree, mildly disagree, neutral, mildly agree, strongly agree. So you're going in both directions, and you have a middle and you have uniform responses. So if my neutral is in the middle, 3, I should only have 2 on either side. I shouldn't have more options, because then it becomes weighted in one direction. Throws off your analysis. Okay, so once you go in, conceptualize, do your conceptualization with the questions, you'll want to do a peer review. So go in and look at the hypothesis, make sure those variables are clear. Has the variable been conceptualized thoroughly? So give feedback on how they, if that peer, if their conceptualization is missing anything, or you think it should include anything, or do you think that there is information that they missed, or needs to be explained more concretely. Give them that feedback. Have they done a good job at making their abstract concepts as concrete and clear as possible? How many different components do you see that needed to be addressed within each variable? And can those be measured? Remember, things can only be measured. You can ask people their opinion, right? And so we can measure opinions on things, but you have to be able to see it, hear it, say it, touch it, taste it, right? That's how we measure things. It has to be tangible in some way. So even somebody telling you their opinion and taking it down is tangible and therefore measurable. Now, can you say that their opinion is applicable to real life consequences? For example, one that was done years ago, a student was asking business owners' opinion in Newport about the marijuana industry. And so the opinion of current business owners in Newport, she found, was that they believed that having legitimate marijuana businesses in their community, ones that were legal, but running in their community, increased crime. And she wanted to make the argument that legal marijuana businesses increase crime. You can say that people have that opinion if you found that opinion, but you cannot say that it inherently increased crime just because someone has that opinion that it does, whether they own a business or not. So that's one of also kind of the ways that bias can get us. We want so badly for our value or our preconceived notion to be correct that we're trying to do data to prove that we're right. And you're never, or we're trying to do research to prove that we're right, and you're never supposed to do that. The next one is, are the questions or observations directly linked to the components within the variable? So you would look at it, again, that's why we do the review sheet thing, and we connect them to each part. And so as you're reading through the conceptualization and then looking at the questions, does it logically make sense that it's linked there? Do you think that they could add something, or do you think that they need to separate something into multiple questions? Is everything that needs to be identified and assessed actually done so through a question or an observation? Did they create the visual diagram linkage? In other words, did they use review and make sure that you could follow it? So do they have the little questions linked directly into their conceptualization? And did they revise and fill in any gaps that they may have had? So when you look at their questions after they've written a survey and do a peer review, you would want to check to see, or if you're asking someone to review your survey, give them the written, typed out, printed survey and have them check for these things. Biased or leading questions, double-barreled questions, unclear questions, not following Shively's rule. You might have to explain what that is to people. That'll only help you understand it, which means you also have to explain to people nominal, ordinal, interval ratio concepts, and then were their answers complete, comprehensive, mutually exclusive, and did the survey avoid irrelevant responses? Similar if you're doing a focus group or an interview. This is kind of the directions, observation or content analysis as well. Okay, so usually this is kind of the work we do in class, right? But when you write your survey, you want to make sure you follow these things. At the top, you clearly state your intentions with the research before the survey. This is a rule that you have to do, an ethics rule. Internal Review Board, IRB. It's an ethics rule. And so you always have to make clear what it is, your intentions that you're doing. It's a little bit of a catch-22 though, because you have to explain your research well enough so that people are informed, but be vague enough so that you don't create biased or leading responses because you've explained the intentions of your research. So it's a little bit tricky. They need to be informed. They need to know what your research is, but they should not see your research question. They should not see your hypothesis in the survey. And they should know what it's about without knowing what exactly you're testing in a way that would create them to give you answers that they think you want. That would create a validity issue for your test. And then just make sure you follow the rest of this. Include the instructions. Don't ask for personal information if you need it. If you do, you put it at the end. It's called demographic questions. So demographic questions are: how much money do you make? How old are you? Where do you live? Those kinds of things. Keep the questions as short and concise as possible. Be conscious to avoid the common mistakes. Ask questions that can be answered by your subjects, and present the questions in a clear and organized layout. And then once you do that, make sure you test your survey. Have at least 2 people take your survey and then give you feedback on the questions. Not just take your survey, but if there's a problematic question, you need to know about it before you start giving it out. Otherwise, you'll run into an analysis problem. Okay, just a thought. Have a great day. Bye.